The wreckers had her by the wrist when I came around the steam line with a ladle still in my hand and the small one was not making a sound, which is how I knew she had already learned the worst lesson a child can learn, which is that screaming brings the wrong people faster than it brings the right ones. There were two of them, Hans Crew, by the brand burned into the leather at their collars, a curl of rope inside a broken ring, the mark the salvage gangs wore at Hollowport back then, when the law was 3 weeks away by fast cutter and never came in time for anything that mattered. The taller one had her arm twisted up behind a stack of grain drums where the morning crowd wouldn't see. The short one was already counting on his fingers the way they did when they were pricing a stray off the manifest of nobody, a child with no name on any list, no kin at the gate, no charter behind her, which to a Hans man meant free weight he could sell down the line to whatever pit took small hands. I did not run. I have never been able to run, not since the cold years took the give out of my left hip, and a cook who runs spills the pot anyway. I walked. I came around the drums with my apron still wet from the dawn wash and the ladle dripping a thin line of stew down onto the boards, and I put myself between the short one and the gap he meant to drag her through, and I said the only thing that has ever worked on men like that, which is a flat and boring fact spoken like it bores me too. She eats here, I said. She's on my roll. You're touching my staff. It was a lie the size of the moon, and we all knew it. The child was not on my roll. I had never seen her before that morning. But Hollowport ran on rolls and charters and lists, and a man who steals weight that is claimed is a man who buys himself a feud, and a feud cuts into margin, and the Hans crew were salvage, not soldiers. They did sums before they did violence. I watched the short one do the sum. I watched him look at me, an old woman in a stained apron with a ladle and a bad hip, and I watched him do the other sum too, the one where he weighs whether I am worth the trouble, and I let him see nothing in my face but the boredom of a woman who has stood over a pot for 30 years and is not in a hurry about anything. No tag on her, the short one said. No mark, no kin. There's a mark, I said. It's mine. You missed it. The tall one shifted his grip, and the child made the smallest sound then, not a cry, just an intake, a little catch of breath through a throat that had clearly been taught not to use it, and something in me that I keep banked down low like a fire you don't let go out came up about a half a degree. I did not let it reach my face. That is the whole trick of it, if there's a trick. You let it warm your spine and you keep your voice cold. I'll feed you both, I said. Hot, now, on the house. And you put her down and you walk to my counter and you sit and we forget the morning happened. Or you carry her through that gap and you find out what it costs to short a kitchen at Hollowport. I've fed every dock boss on this water for 3 turns of the long year. You think they buy their cruisers breakfast out of their own purse? Take the girl and you'll eat cold for the rest of your contracts. Both crews of you. I'll see to it personal. It was mostly bluster. But bluster works when it's stacked on a true thing. And the true thing was this. I did feed the dock bosses every dawn, 200 bowls before the tide turned, and a port runs on its stomach. And a cook who decides your crew goes hungry is a small, slow kind of curse that follows a man down a long coast. They knew it. The short one knew it best because he was the one who did sums. He looked at the tall one. He tipped his head at the gap, then away from it. The tall one let go of her wrist like it had gone hot, and the small one dropped down onto her heels in the gap between the drums and did not bolt, which surprised me, and stayed exactly where she had been put, which did not surprise me at all, and which I have thought about a great many nights since. Stew's good, the short one said, like that had been the plan, and they came around to my counter and sat on the long bench and I ladled them, each a bowl, and watched them eat, and did not once turn my back on them until they'd gone, and that is how I met her. Over a theft I prevented with a lie and a ladle and the standing of a woman who feeds 200 men their dawn. I should tell you where this is, so you can see it. Hollowport is not a place you've heard of, and there's no reason you would have. It's a salt-crusted shelf town built into the lee side of a sea stack the size of a mountain, on a world the charters called Marrow's Reach, and everyone who actually lived there just called the Reach, and the whole of it clings to the rock above a tide that comes in like a wall twice a day and goes out a half league and leaves the flats steaming. The harbor's a drowned canyon. Ships come in on the high water and sit down on cradles when it draws off, and for 6 hours twice a day the whole port is a city built on a dry seabed, and then the wall comes back and you'd better be above the line. My kitchen was on the 3rd shelf, cut back into the rock, open to the quay, a long iron range I'd built up over the years from salvaged ship plate, and a chimney that drew its smoke up through a natural flue in the stone so that on a still dawn you could see the gray thread of it from a half day out at sea, and the men coming in off the water steered for it. That smoke meant breakfast. It meant you'd lived another night on the water, and there was something hot at the end of it. I'd been there 30 years by then. I came to the reach young and angry and running from a thing I won't put in this account because it isn't this account's business, and I found a cold rock and a hungry port and a trade I was good at, and I stayed, and the anger cooked down over the decades the way a stock does, into something thicker and quieter and more useful. I had no people. I'd made that choice early and kept it. I fed the port and the port let me alone, and that was the arrangement, and it suited me, and I want you to understand that before I tell you the rest, because what came after was not a lonely woman filling a hole in her life with a stray. I had no hole. I was a whole and finished thing, set in my ways, and I did not want a child, and I want that on the record. What I wanted was for those two handsmen to not drag a small one through a gap in the grain drums while I watched. That's a different want. That's the want that ran the whole rest of it. She wouldn't come out from the drums for an hour after they'd gone. I let her be. I had a kitchen to run, the second sitting coming in off the morning hall, and a child who has just been let go by men like that needs to watch the world prove itself safe again on its own clock, not be hauled out into it on yours. So I cooked. I worked the range and called the orders and took the chits, and I let her watch me from the gap, and now and then I set a thing on the near end of the counter where she could see it and reach it if she chose. A heel of biscuit, a cup of the thin sweet tea I kept for the ones who came in shaking off the cold. I didn't look at her when I did it. You don't look at a thing you're trying to coax. You look at the pot. She was not human. I'd known that the second I came around the drums, of course. But it's worth saying, plainly, because most of you will never have seen one of the people of the vault, which is the nearest thing the charters had to a name for her kind. The vault-born, the ones the deep rock colonies put out before the colonies failed. She was small, smaller than a human child of the same standing would have been, and built fine and light the way creatures bred for low places are built. Her skin was a pale slate, the gray-blue of wet stone, and it took the light strangely, soft, like it drank a little of it. Her eyes were too large for her face and a deep amber that caught the range fire and held it, and they did not blink the way ours do. A second clear lid came across them sideways now and then, a flick when she was thinking. Her ears came up to delicate points and turned, a little, toward sounds independent of each other, so that I learned later you could tell what she was attending to, by which way her ears had gone, even when her eyes were down. Her hair was a fine, pale, colorless silk, nearly white, and it lay flat and damp against her skull. And her hands, I noticed her hands first and last and always. Her hands had one more joint in each finger than mine do, long and clever and gray. And the pads of them were a darker slate, calloused in a pattern no surface-bred child would have, the calluses of someone who had spent her short life feeling her way along rock in the dark. That was the thing about the vault-born, the thing I came to understand slowly over the months that followed, and that I'll tell you now so you'll understand the rest. They did not see the way we see. They could in light, but light was new to them, and a little painful and not how their minds were built. They knew the world by touch and by sound and by the press of air, by the way a hum came back off a wall, by the temperature of stone under a palm. She had been born in the dark of a deep colony, and the colony had died around her. I never learned the whole of it. The rock rot that took the air recyclers, the slow suffocation of a buried town. The few who got out hauled up to the surface they'd never seen and scattered down the charter lanes as freight nobody claimed. She had come up out of the ground into a world of light and wind and open sky, all of it wrong, all of it loud, and she had no people in it, and she had learned in whatever weeks or months it had taken her to reach my port that the surface was full of short men who counted on their fingers. So she knew rock. She knew the dark and the press of stone and the hum that comes back off a wall. And my kitchen, cut back into the sea stack, with its iron range and its stone flue and the great tide wall booming twice a day against the rock below, was the first place she'd come to since the dark that spoke a language she knew. That's why she stayed in the gap between the drums. Not because she was trapped there, because the drums was grain, and the wall behind them was living rock, and she could feel the tide through it, and for the first time since the colony fell, she was leaning against something that made sense. I figured that out later. That first morning, I just knew she wouldn't come, and I cooked, and I left things on the counter, and along about the slack of the tide, when the port goes quiet and the men are out on the flats, working the cradles, I heard the smallest scrape, and I didn't turn, and when I finally did, slow, there was an empty cup on the near end of the counter, and she was back in the gap, and the biscuit heel was gone too. You can have more than that, I said to the pot. There's always more here. That's the one thing there's always more of. She didn't answer. I didn't expect her to. I didn't even know yet whether she had the surface speech at all, the charter cant that ran the lanes, or whether she had only the deep tongue of the vault, which I'd heard once or twice in my life, and which isn't sound so much as it is something between a hum and a pressure, felt in the chest more than heard in the ear. So I didn't push at speech, I pushed at warmth. which is the only thing I've ever had to offer anybody, a hot bowl and a dry place, and the steady noise of a person working nearby who means you no harm. I closed the kitchen that night the way I always did, banked the range, hung the pots, dropped the iron shutter halfway against the coal that comes up off the flats when the tide's out. I did not drop it all the way, I left the gap. And I made up, without quite deciding to, a second pallet near the warm flank of the range where the stone stayed hot through the night, with a salvaged ship blanket I'd been meaning to cut up for rags, and I set a covered bowl beside it, and I went to my own bed at the back. And I lay there a long time in the dark listening, the way you listen for a cat you've decided to let in, and somewhere in the deep middle of the night I heard the small scrape of the shutter and the lighter scrape of something settling onto the pallet by the range, and the kitchen went quiet and I slept. In the morning the bowl was empty and she was gone back to the gap, but the blanket had been folded, not bunched. Folded, careful, into a neat gray square, the way you fold a thing you mean to give back because you don't believe yet that it's yours to keep. I have folded a great many blankets in my life. I have never folded one as careful as a child who owns nothing folds the first warm thing the world hands her. I left it where she'd folded it, and I started the dawn stew, and the smoke went up the flue and out into the gray, and the men steered in for it off the water, and the day began the way every day began, except that now there was a small gray someone in the gap between the grain drums who had folded my blanket, and the arrangement I'd had with the port for 30 years, feed them and they let me be, had quietly, without my permission, acquired an exception. She stayed because of the wall, I told myself, the tide wall she could feel through the rock, and that was true, but it was not the whole truth, and I knew it within the week. She stayed because of the counter, not the food on it, though that mattered. A child does not refuse food twice, but the counter itself, the long iron edge of it, because of what happened at it. What happened at it was that I worked, and she watched, and slowly, over days, the watching turned into a kind of helping that I did not ask for and did not refuse. The first time it was the kindling. I keep my fire spruce in a bin by the range, and on a cold morning your hands are stiff and you fumble it. And I dropped a stick, and before I'd bent for it, her long gray hand had come out from under the counter where she'd taken to sitting in the warm. She'd given up the gap. By then, she sat under the near end of the counter with her back against the warm flue stone, in the dark of it, where she could see the quay through the gap below the counter edge, but no one passing could see her. And she put the stick back in the bin, and the hand went away again, fast, like it had touched something hot. "Thank you," I said to the pot, and went on cooking. After that, it was small things, and then it was not so small. She learned the kitchen by feel the way she'd learned the colony, in the dark under the counter, her palms reading the warm stone and the cold stone and the place where the floor dipped and the drain ran. She knew, before I did, when the range was about to go sullen, because she could feel the heat change in the flue through the stone at her back. She'd reach up and tap the counter twice, 2 small raps with that extra jointed finger, and I learned that the 2 taps meant the fire wanted feeding, and she was right every time, before the smoke would have told me, before the men would have noticed their tea going off the boil. I started feeding the fire on her 2 taps without even checking, and the port never knew that for a season their dawn ran on the ear of a small gray child who could hear the heart of my range through a foot of sea, stone. That was the first thing I understood about her people that the charters never bothered to learn, being in the business of weighing them, not knowing them. The vault-born weren't fragile, they were precise. They had lived 1,000 years in the deep rock by reading it exactly, by knowing to the breath when the air was going wrong and the stone was shifting and the heat was failing, and that precision didn't die when the colony died. It just had nowhere to go. Up on the surface, in the loud, bright wrongness of the open world, all that fine-tuned attention had nothing to read but threat. She'd been reading short men's footsteps for weeks. Now she had a range to read instead, and a flue and a tide and the gray smoke going up and a woman moving steady at the counter, and the attention had something to settle on that wasn't fear. I gave her a name in the 3rd week because the port had started to ask after the little gray one, and I didn't like the port having a handle on her that I didn't choose. I called her Slate for the color of her, and because it's an honest plain word with no charter on it, and the first time I said it to her, Slate, tea's hot, her ears both turned to me at once, which they'd never done, both at once, the full attention, and her clear sideways lids flicked once, and she didn't say anything. But she came out from under the counter and took the cup from my hand instead of waiting for me to set it down, which she had never done, and that was the day I stopped telling myself she stayed for the wall. She had the surface speech. I found that out slow too. She'd had it all along, some of it, picked up on the lanes the way a child picks up the words that keep her alive. Of crews, names for danger, the can't for no, the can't for claimed. but she hoarded it. She spent words the way she folded blankets carefully, like she didn't believe they were hers to spend. The first whole sentence she ever gave me, she gave me at the slack of the tide one gray noon when the port was out on the flats and the kitchen was quiet, and she came and stood at my elbow, which she'd started to do, and she watched me skim the fat off the top of the long stock pot, and she said, in a voice like a low note played on a stone, careful and accented strange, the deep ones did this too. Did what, child? Kept the pot for everyone in the dark. Her ears moved. When a colony fed all its weight from one pot, the pot never went cold. The keeper of the pot was not weight. The keeper of the pot was, and here she used a word of the deep tongue, the hum and pressure word, and I felt it more than heard it, a low thing in my breastbone, and she saw that I'd felt it, and her clear lids flicked pleased, and she did not translate it, and I didn't ask her to, because some things you understand without the surface word for them. The keeper of the pot was not freight. The keeper of the pot was the one thing in a buried town that the dark could not be allowed to take. Well, I said after a while, because my throat had done something I didn't care for. Then I suppose you and I are in the same trade. No, she said, with the flat certainty children have. You keep the pot, I keep the fire. And she reached up and tapped the counter twice, and the range was indeed going sullen, and I fed it, and that was the arrangement settled, the real one, the one that replaced the 30-year arrangement I'd had with the port. The port fed me its custom, and I let it be. Slate kept my fire, and I kept her pot. I have signed contracts in my life that meant less and held worse. I would like to tell you it stayed that simple. It did not, because Hollowport was not a simple place, and a small gray child who has been let go once by a Hans crew does not stop being weight on a list just because an old woman named her. She'd been priced. The short one had done the sum and walked away from it that morning, but a sum walked away from is not a sum forgotten, and the salvage gangs kept their own ledgers. And somewhere in a Hans ledger there was a line that said, in whatever shorthand they used, Gray Stray, Vault-born, Deep Rock Stock, Unclaimed, one ladle woman in the way, revisit. They revisited on a low tide morning at the back end of that first season, and they didn't send the short one, and they didn't send two. I knew before they came up the shelf, because Slate knew. She was under the counter, and her ears went flat, and both turned the same way, down the shelf toward the cradle yards. She went very still in a way I'd come to read, and she tapped the counter, not the 2 taps for the fire. 3 hard. A pattern she'd never used, and I understood it the way you understand a thing the first time it matters, which is to say, completely and at once. 3 hard taps meant footsteps that walked like the short man walked. Footsteps that counted. How many? I said low, not looking down. A pause while she read the rock. Then, in the stone-low voice, 5 and one that doesn't walk. Carried or rolling. Heavy, it stops when they stop. It listens. Her clear lids came across and stayed. It hums. A thing that hums and listens and gets carried and is heavy. I'd been on the reach 30 years, and I knew what that was, and it turned my stomach, and I kept ladling, because the second sitting was at my counter, and a cook who stops ladling tells the whole port something's wrong. Get back to the flustone, I said, all the way back, where it's warm and dark and you can feel the wall. Don't come out for anything, not my voice, not your name, not the pot. You hear me? Not even if I call you, especially not if I call you. If I call you, it's because they've made me, and you stay put. You'll lie to me, she said, not a question. A child of the deep, reading the situation exactly. I'll lie to you, I agreed. And you'll know it's a lie, and you'll stay put. And that's how I keep the fire while you keep it back there safe. 2 keepers. Go, she went. I heard the small scrape of her settling into the dark against the warm flustone at the very back, behind the dry stores, where the rock was thickest, and a person small enough could fold herself into a fault in the stone, and the heat from the range came through and pooled, and where I had made sure over the season without ever saying so, there was a second way out, a crack in the flue that a small gray body could climb, up through the dark of the sea stack to the high shelf, in the dark by feel, the one kind of road she could travel better than anything alive. I had not told her it was there. I had only made sure she'd found it, the way I made sure she'd found the blanket. You don't hand a deep rock child a door. You let her feel for it and find it's already cut. Then I wiped my hands on my apron, and I came around to the front of my counter for the second time that year, and I waited for the salvage crew and the heavy thing that hummed. The thing that hummed was a RIT engine, and if you've never seen one, count yourself among the lucky stretch of the galaxy the salvage law never reached. It came up my shelf on a low-wheeled cradle pushed by 2 of the 5, a squat gray drum of a machine the height of a man's chest, ribbed with cooling fins, a single dull lens on a stalk that turned and turned, and from it that low hum that Slate had felt through the rock, the sound of a thing that was always listening, always recording, always weighing what it heard against the law of the lanes and pricing the difference. The Hans crews ran them because the law was 3 weeks away, and a writ engine was the law you could carry. It heard a claim and it tested the claim, and if the claim was false, it logged the falsehood. And the falsehood became a debt, and the debt became a lien, and the lien became, in the end, a body sold to settle it. It was the short man's finger counting made into a machine, and it did not bore, and it did not do sums and walk away, and you could not feed it stew. The man who walked in front of it was not the short one. He was older, with the still gray face of a man who'd long ago stopped enjoying his work and gone on doing it anyway, and he wore the broken ring brand at his collar over a coat that had once been good, and he came to the front of my counter and stood, and the writ engine rolled up beside him and turned its lens on me and hummed. "You're the cook," he said. "I'm the cook. Season back." 2 of my crew came up short a piece of stock. Gray Stray, vault-borne deep rock stock, premium weight for the down lane pits. They pay for the precision. Those ones make good readers in the deep mines. Hear a gas pocket through a wall. He said it the way you'd read a manifest. My crew logged it claimed by you on your roll. A pause. "We've checked your roll. There's no gray stray on it. There's no gray anything on it." Which means a claim was made against my stock that the record doesn't bear, and that he nodded at the humming drum, is a false lien, and a false lien runs the wrong way. The debt's yours now. The stray, plus the season she's cost me, plus the falsehood. The engine's already pricing it. The lens turned. The hum changed pitch, climbing, the sound of a machine doing arithmetic on my life. Here is the thing I understood in that moment, standing at my own counter with my hip aching, and the second sitting gone silent on the benches behind the handsman, every dock hand in the place suddenly very interested in his bowl. I understood that the machine was the whole of their strength and the whole of their weakness at once. It ran on the record. It tested claims against the record. It had no eyes for anything that wasn't a claim and no judgment that wasn't arithmetic, and that meant it could be lied to. But only by the truth, only by a true claim it couldn't price down. A bluster wouldn't move it. The ladle and feud bluff that had turned the short man wouldn't make a writ engine blink. It didn't care about feuds, it cared about liens. So I would have to give it a lien of my own, a true one, bigger than theirs, and I had about the length of a hum to find one. I am not a clever woman. I want to be honest about that in this account, because the stories the port tells about that morning have got cleverer every year, and I'd rather you had the plain one. I'm not clever. I'm slow and I'm stubborn, and I've stood over a pot for 30 years thinking about very little, and it turns out that a slow, stubborn person with 30 years of standing in one place has, without ever meaning to, accumulated a great deal of true record, and true record is the only ammunition a writ engine respects. "Price this first," I said. "Before you price me, you're salvage, you run on the lanes. The lanes run on the ports. This port runs on its stomach, and its stomach is my range, and that range hasn't gone cold one dawn in 30 years, which the harbor record will bear, because the cradle master logs the breakfast smoke against the tide tables every morning of his life. It's how the ships time their run-in. 30 years of smoke logged. Now, there's a clause in the lane charter, provision and wayfare. It's old, it's boring. No handsman's read it in a generation because it's never been worth reading. That says a registered victualler of a charter port holds a standing claim against any party whose action stops the port's provision, stops the smoke. Because a port that can't feed its ships is a port that can't service the lanes, and that's not my loss. That's the lane's loss, and the lanes are the engine's master, not you." The hum stuttered. I leaned on the counter, because my hip was screaming, and because a woman who leans looks like a woman who's bored, and I said it slow so the machine could log every word clean. "You've come up my shelf in front of my second sitting with a writ engine to press a lien over a stray that's on my roll. She's not on your, and I'm registering right now to that engine a counter lien under provision and wayfare, that the Hans crew's action this season has twice stopped the lawful provision of a charter port, because both times your men came up my shelf, my range went off its dawn while I dealt with you, and the cradle master's smoke log will show the gap. 2 mornings logged against the tide, 2 stop provisions. Price that. Price what the lanes charge a salvage crew that twice broke the breakfast of the port they run their freight through. Price it against your little stray, and then tell me whose debt runs which way." The lens turned to the gray-faced man. The hum climbed, and then did a thing I have never forgotten, a thing that I'm told writ engines do when 2 liens cross and the cheaper one has to yield. It dropped. The whole pitch of it fell down and down to a low grinding settle, the sound of a machine letting go of a number, because a bigger, truer number had come in over the top of it. And the gray-faced man's still face did something at the corner of the mouth, not anger, something more like the tiredness of a man who has watched a sure thing come apart and knows exactly how much paperwork it's going to cost him. "You don't have it registered," he said. "The counter lien. You're saying it. Saying isn't filing. I'm filing it to your engine, I said. Your engine's a registered instrument of the lane court. It logs what it hears. It's logging this. You carried the law up my shelf, friend. You don't get to carry only the half of it that suits you. The cradle master pulls the smoke log at the next law cutter, and your counterlien's got a witness 3 weeks deep in harbor record before you've sailed. You want to gamble your contracts on a lane judge weighing a deep stray's price against 2-stop provisions and a false lien your own engine already logged climbing. You're salvage. You do sums. Do this one. I did not raise my voice once. That's the part the port's version always gets wrong, the part where I'm supposed to have thundered. I didn't thunder. I leaned on my counter and bored a machine into letting a child go because the machine was built to be bored into things by anyone with a truer number, and I happened to have spent 30 years accidentally building one. The gray-faced man did the sum. I watched him do it the way I'd watched the short one do his, and it came out the same way because salvage men are consistent if they are nothing else. And the answer to the sum was that I was more trouble than the stray was worth. For now, on the record, in front of a logging engine and a bench full of witnesses. Pull it back, he said to the two on the cradle, and the RIT engine's lens swung off me, and the hum dropped to its idle, and they wheeled the law back down my shelf the way they'd brought it up, and the gray-faced man went last, and at the top of the shelf he stopped and looked back at me, and he said a thing that I have carried for the rest of my life, said flat, not as a threat, just as a man stating the shape of the world. Engines, go off the record, he said. You're good with the record, but there's lanes out past the law cutter's run where nobody logs the smoke, and a stray's a stray and a season's a long time, and you're old. He let that sit. You can win the morning, you can't keep the morning. Not over the years. Sooner or later, there's a tide you're not standing over your pot, and there's no record covers that. Then he went, and the second sitting started breathing again, and somebody at the bench laughed too loud the way men do when the danger's past, and I went back behind my counter and ladled out the rest of the pot with hands that I was glad to see did not shake, because I'd kept them busy, and that's the trick of the hands. You keep them busy, and they keep their counsel. I did not call Slate out. I told her not to come even for the pot, even for her name, and a thing I have learned about keeping a child is that the first time you tell her a hard true thing, you'd best mean it. So I let her stay in the dark by the warm flewstone the whole rest of that low tide. And I cooked the second sitting, and then the slack tide trickle, and then I banked the range for the turn, and only when the wall came booming back in, and the port came up off the flats and the kitchen emptied, and the iron shutter was down, and we were alone, only then did I go back behind the dry stores and crouch, slow on the bad hip, at the mouth of the fault in the rock where she'd folded herself in, and I did not reach in for her, because you do not reach for a deep child in her dark. You wait at the edge of it, and I said, lo, it's the slack. They're gone. The shutter's down, the wall's in. You can feel the walls in. A pause. I'm going to make the night stew. There'll be a bowl on the warm stone by the range. I'm not going to call you to it. You come when the rock tells you it's true and not before. And I got up slow and went and made the night stew, and a long while later, when the steam off the fresh pot had filled the kitchen with the smell of it, I heard the small scrape, and she came out of the dark and stood at my elbow, and she didn't take the bowl. She reached up and tapped the counter twice, the fire tap, though the fire was steady, and I understood that she wasn't reading the fire. She was telling me something. She was saying I'm still keeping it. I'm still here. I came back to the post. I know, I said. Eat. She ate, and then she said in the stone-low, careful voice, looking at the bowl and not at me, the thing the gray-faced man had said, repeated back exact, the way she repeated everything she meant to keep. You can win the morning. You can't keep the morning, not over the years. Her clear lids came across. He's right. He's right about the lanes and the law and the smoke, I said. He's right that I'm old. He's wrong about the one thing. And it's the thing that matters, and I'll tell it to you once, and you'll keep it the way you keep things. He thinks the morning is a thing you stand over like a pot, and if you step away, it's lost. But the morning isn't the pot, child. The morning is the keeping of the pot, and a keeping can be handed on. That's the whole trade. That's the deep one's word you wouldn't translate for me, the keeper of the pot. The keeper isn't weight, and the keeper isn't the pot. The keeper is the thing that gets handed down the dark so the pot never goes cold, even when the one who lit it does. You understand me? He's right that there's a tide coming I won't be standing over. He's wrong that it's the end of the morning. It's only the end of my watch on it. She looked at me a long time, both ears full on me, the clear lid still, the amber holding the range fire. You're telling me I'm the next keeper, she said. I'm telling you the post exists, I said. I'm not handing it to you tonight. You're too small, and you've too much dark still in you. And there's years of fire tapping and blanket folding between here and there. I'm only telling you it's a real post, and it gets handed down, and the salvage man, for all he counts, has never once in his life understood the one thing my whole trade is built on, which is that the pot outlasts the cook. Now, eat your stew before it skins over. You've let it sit. That's the one crime in my kitchen. She ate. And after that night, something changed in how she kept the fire, a steadiness to it, like a child who has been told the work is real and means to be found worthy of it. And I won't pretend the years that followed were not also full of trouble, because they were. The reach was the reach. But I will tell you that the gray-faced man's tide was a long time coming, longer than he or I expected, and a great deal of good fire was kept between his warning and its arrival. And that is the part of this that I would not trade. But I'm getting ahead of the account, the way old women do, jumping to the comfortable end and skipping the hard middle. And the hard middle is the part you need, because the hard middle is where she became what she became, and what she became is why she came back grown, and her coming back grown is the whole reason I'm setting any of this down. So let me go back to the years, and the fire, and the slow making of a keeper out of a stray, and the day the salvage man's long tide finally came in, because come in it did. There was a season, early on before she was grown enough to stand at the counter beside me, when the trouble came not on a manifest but off the water, and I'll set it down because it's the one time the keeping nearly failed. And it failed in the one way I hadn't armored against, and a keeper learns more from the near miss than from any clean win. It came in on the dead low of a spring tide, the longest draw of the year, when the harbor's a half-league of steaming flat and the ships sit down dead on their cradles and a man can walk out across the seabed for a quarter of the morning before the wall comes back. The salvage gangs hated the long draw because there's no fast water to run on, but raiders loved it. The real raiders, not the Hants counting men, but the wet crews off the deep coast who came in over the flats on foot at dead low and took what could be carried before the wall came in and covered their road behind them. They came perhaps once in 5 years, and the port had a bell for them, up on the high shelf, and the bell that spring went late, because the watch on the high shelf was an old drunk named Pell, who'd had a skinful and was asleep at his post, and the first the port knew of the wet crew was when they were already up off the flats and into the low cradles, and by then the wall was already turning, already coming, which was the raiders' whole craft. They timed it so the alarm and the tide arrived together, and the port had to choose between fighting them and getting above the line. I knew none of that when it started. What I knew was that Slate, under the counter in the warm dark, went rigid, and both her ears went flat and turned the same way, down and out toward the flats. And she tapped the counter, not 3 hard for footsteps that count, not 2 for the fire, a new thing. A long roll of taps, fast, urgent, a drumming I'd never heard, and she said in the stone-low voice gone tight, many on the flats, coming up wet. The whole bottom of the rock is full of them walking, and the wall's turning. I can feel the wall turning under them. They're inside the turn, and I understood cold that she was feeling the raid through the seabed before any human eye on the high shelf had seen a thing. Feeling boots on the drowned canyon floor through a foot of sea stock, the way she felt a gas pocket, the way she felt my heart, and that her deep ear had just bought the port the only warning it was going to get. I did the thing I'd never have thought I'd do, which is I trusted a child's hand on the stone over my own eyes on the empty-looking quay, and I rang the wrong bell. There's a fire gong by my range, brass for the kitchen for a flue fire, a sound the whole port knows means trouble at the cook's. It's not the raider bell. But the raider bell was up the shelf with a drunk asleep under it, and my fire gong was in my hand, so I rang it, hard, the wrong alarm, the only one I had, and I rang it in a pattern long, 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 the way the raider bell goes, hoping the port would hear the cook's brass gong beating the raider pattern and understand. And the port, God bless a port's stomach, understood, because they steered by my smoke and they knew my gong, and a cook beating raider time on a fire gong at dead low tide was wrong in exactly the way that wakes men up and the low shelves came alive, and the wet crew lost the one thing their whole craft depended on, which was the alarm arriving too late. It was a hard hour, I won't make it more than it was. The port held, the way a port holds, with cradle hooks and gaff poles, and the sheer numbers of 100 dock hands roused early, and the wall came in on schedule and took the raiders' road behind them and turned their retreat into a trap, and the ones who didn't get back down to the flats before the wall covered them had a long, cold choice to make about surrender, and most made it. We lost 2 men and a season's stores off the 9th shelf, and old Pell lost his post and his welcome both, and it could have been the whole port. The whole low end of it carried off over the flats, if a gray child under a counter hadn't felt the bottom of the rock fill up with walking and rung me to the wrong bell. But here's the near miss, the part a keeper learns from. In the thick of that hour, when the low cradles were full of fighting, and I was beating the gong and shouting the count down to the cradle master, I lost track of Slate. I told her, the old order, get back to the flue stone, don't come out, and I trusted her to obey it the way she'd obeyed it the day of the RIT engine. But a raid is not a RIT engine. A RIT engine comes to the counter and hums. A raid comes up every shelf at once, and there was a moment, I still go cold on it, when a wet crew man came up over the third shelf rail, not 3 strides from my range, looking for stores or weight or anything not nailed down. And my range was between him and the dry stores where a gray child was folded into the rock, and he came toward the warm of it the way a cold, wet man comes toward a fire. And I was across the kitchen at the gong, and I could not get to her. And the truer number, the record, the provision and wayfare clause, none of it meant a thing, because a wet raider off the deep coast cannot be filed against. He does not hear a lien. You cannot bore him. He is the one trouble the cook's whole art does not touch. What saved her was not me. It was the second road. The crack in the flue I'd let her find years before and never spoken of, the dark vertical climb up through the sea stack to the high shelf, the one kind of road a deep child travels better than anything alive. She'd gone up it. The moment the rock filled with walking, she'd not stayed at the flue stone at all. She'd read the whole shape of it through the stone, felt the third shelf was no longer safe dark, and taken the dark road up in the black by feel, a fault in the living rock the way her people had climbed for 1,000 years. And she came out on the high shelf in the middle of the raid, and this is the part the port tells, because I didn't see it. I was at my gong. She came out right at the raider bell, where old Pell lay drunk and useless under it, and she could not ring it. Her gray hands didn't know the great bell rope, but she did the thing she did know. She put her hand flat on the bell's bronze and read it and found the beam it hung from, and the beam ran back into the rock, and she climbed the beam to where it socketed in the stone, and she drummed on the rock at the socket. Hard, the long raider roll, her own taps and the bronze hung from a beam set in stone, took the drumming up through its own metal and rang, not loud, not a full peal, but a strange high shivering tone that ran out over the flats, and that the wet crew, who'd timed their whole raid on the bell staying silent, heard and could not place and did not like, a bell ringing itself off a rock with no man at the rope. And the port says it put a fear in them that the gaff poles never could, a high stone-rung bell with no ringer, and that it was that, as much as the wall, that broke them. She'd rung the raider bell with her hands flat on the rock, from inside the stone, the way she heard the fire and the lie and my slipping heart. The deep child's whole gift, the precision the charters only ever wanted for hearing gas pockets in a down-lane pit, had reached up through a sea stack and rung a bell no one could reach and turned a raid. I found her after, when the wall was full in and the port was counting its dead and its stores, up on the high shelf, sitting with her back against the warm of the bell's beam, her gray hands raw from the climb and the drumming, and I crouched at the edge of her dark the way I always did, and I did not reach for her, and after a while she said, stone low, not looking at me, I came out. You told me to stay at the flue stone. I came out. You came up the second road, I said. The one I never told you was there. Her clear lids flicked. You knew I'd find it. I knew you'd find it. That's why I never told you. A door you're handed can be taken back. A door you find is yours. I let that sit, the way you let stock sit. You didn't come out to run, child. You came out and rang a bell off a rock with your hands because the port was in the rock and you could feel it and you wouldn't leave it unrung. That's not coming out. That's keeping. You kept the whole port this morning, not just the fire. I'd have rung the wrong bell and lost the low shelves. You rang the right one off a stone with no rope. Don't you ever tell me again that you came out like it's a thing you did wrong. She looked at me then, both ears full on, the amber holding what was left of the morning light, and she didn't say anything, but she got up, raw hands and all, and she came down the high shelf with me, slow, matching my bad hip, and we went back to the range, and she tapped the counter twice, the fire tap, the fire long since gone sullen and out in the chaos of the morning, and I knelt, slow, on the bad hip, the way I knelt at the gap in the drums the first morning, and I built it back up from the banked coals, and the smoke went up the flue, late but going, and the ships that had ridden the raid out on their cradles saw the gray thread of it climb and knew. The port had held, and somewhere out past the flats the last of the wet crew, waiting for the deep coast ahead of the wall, looked back at a salt shelf town with its breakfast smoke going up like any morning, and learned the thing the gray-faced man would learn slower and harder years later, which is that you do not break a keeping by coming up its shelf at dead low tide, because the keeping is not the cook and not the fire, and not even the bell. The keeping is the hand that will climb a rock in the dark to ring a stone, and there is no tide low enough and no road wet enough to get around a thing like that. The years did to her what years do, which is everything. Slowly, so you don't see it happen until you look up one day, and the small gray one who folded your blanket is reaching the high shelves without the stool she grew. The vault-born grow slow by our reckoning and fast by their own, and she came up long and fine-boned and gray, and the colorless silk of her hair went a darker slate as she aged, the way I'm told it does with them, the deep ones going gray toward dark as ours go dark toward gray. She kept the fire. She kept it so well that by her 4th season I'd stopped checking the range at all in the dawn rush and just cooked off her taps, 2 for feed it, 1 for its right, and a new one she invented herself, a quick flutter of 3 soft raps that meant a man at the counter is lying about his chit, which she could hear in the change of a voice the way she heard a gas pocket through a wall, and she was never wrong, and the port learned, slow, that you didn't short the ladle woman's kitchen anymore, because the ladle woman had a gray girl under the counter who heard the lie in your throat. That was how the port came to know her, not as a stray, as mine. The gray-faced man had said a stray's a stray on the lawless lanes, and that was true out past the law cutter's run. But here, on my shelf, over the years she stopped being a stray and became a fact of the port, the cook's gray girl, the one who heard the fire and the lie, and a fact of the port is a different thing to steal than a stray off a manifest. I'd made her a fact on purpose, the slow way, the only way I had, by keeping her in plain sight at my counter year on year until the whole reach had folded her into the shape of the place, the way the tide folds a new stone into the shingle until you can't say it was ever loose. That was my long answer to the gray man's long tide. He'd said you can't keep the morning over the years. So I'd spent the years building the morning a great many witnesses. She learned to cook, which I had not taught her on purpose, and which she took the way she took everything, by feel and by precision. She couldn't taste the way I taste. The vault-born red flavor strange, more by smell and by the texture of a thing on the tongue than by the bright surface taste we live for. But she could read a pot's doneness by the change in how the bubbles came up through it, by the sound of the boil going from a rolling knock to a soft, heavy plop as the stock thickened, and she'd reach in and stir at exactly the turn, every time by ear, and I'd watch her and think about a buried town that fed all its weight from one pot that never went cold, and I'd think there's a thread here older than me, running back down into the dark of a world I'll never see, and it's come up out of the ground, and it's standing at my range stirring my stock, and I'd have to go skim something that didn't need skimming. She talked more as the years went, though never freely. She spent words careful to the end. But she'd give me whole evenings sometimes at the slack of the tide, telling me the deep one's way of a thing, and I learned more of the vault from her than the charters ever logged, because the charters logged, weight and slate told me meaning. She told me the deep tongue had no word for orphan. There was no such thing, she said, in a colony, because a child belonged to the keeping, not to a pair. And if the pair that made her went into the dark, then the keeping kept her, the whole town, the pot that never went cold. The horror of the surface, she told me once, flat, not asking for anything, was not that her town had died. Towns died. The deep was hard. The horror was that up here a child could fall out of all keeping at once and become weight on a list, a thing no deep child could be. Because in the deep there was no list. There was only the keeping and the dark, and you were in the keeping or you were dead. There was no third country called freight, where you were alive and unkept and for sale. She'd come up out of the ground into that third country, and it had no name in her tongue, and it was the worst thing she had words for. I have thought about that, more than almost anything anyone has ever said to me, the third country, alive and unkept and for sale. I've fed 200 men a morning for 30 years on a lawless coast, and I have seen that country up close, the whole sprawl of it. And I'll tell you that the deep child had it named better in her stone-low voice than any charter ever managed, and that naming it is half of what my whole life turned out to be, for, though I didn't know it standing at the range, you never do. The salvage gangs came up my shelf twice more over those years, and both times went away again. Once on the provision and wayfare counter lean, same as before, the cradle master's smoke log grown into a thing the lane court actually weighed by. Then, and once, this is the one the port likes best, on nothing but the gray girl herself, grown enough by then to stand at the counter beside me, who tapped the lie in the crew boss's claim so clean that I could read off his false manifest line by line before he'd finished saying it, while the writ engine logged me being right, and the crew boss looked at the two of us, the old cook and the gray girl who hurt his throat, and decided, with the consistency of his trade, that we were more trouble than the weight, and pulled his law back down my shelf. By then the port half believed she was something more than a stray, something out of the deep with a gift on her, and I never corrected the belief, because a belief like that is armor, and I'd take any armor going for her. But the gray-faced man's tide came in anyway. He'd promised it, and he kept his promise, which is the one decent thing I'll say of him, that he was a man whose word came true even when it was a bad word. It came in on a low-tide dawn in the 14th year, and it came in the one way I had never armored against, because you cannot armor a body against time, and the body the tide came for was mine. I went down at the range in the dark before a dawn tide, with the stock just coming to the boil and the first cradle bells ringing out on the flats. And the floor came up at me sideways, and the world went to a high thin ring. And the next thing I knew clear was Slate's gray face above mine and her long hand flat on my breastbone, not pressing reading, the way she read the stone, reading my heart through my chest, the way she'd read the fire through the flue for 14 years. "It's not the end one," she said low, certain before I'd got a word out. "I can feel it. It's a bad one, but it's not the end one. The beat's wrong, but it's not gone. Lie still. The stock's off the boil, I pulled it. The fire's banked. Don't talk." A deep child who'd spent her life reading hearts of stone could read a heart of meat, it turned out, and she was right. It was not the end one. It was the one before the end one, the warning the body sends when the long tide's turned and coming. The Flats Medic came up the shelf when the cradle master ran for him, and he said what Slate had already said in longer words and worse comfort. The heart had slipped and caught, this time, and would slip again, and there was no saying when the catch wouldn't come, and I was old, and I should stop standing over a hot range in the cold dawn, which is to say I should stop being the thing I was, which is a thing no medic has ever once talked a person into. But I'd had 14 years to think on it, on the gray-faced man's tide, and I did not waste the warning the way a younger woman would have, by pretending it hadn't come. I lay on my own pallet that day with the port running itself ragged outside, trying to make its own breakfast and making a poor job of it, and I called Slate to me, and for the first time in 14 years I did not lie to her, not even the small kind lies, and I said, "It's the tide, the one he promised. It's not in today, and maybe not this season, but it's turned and it's coming, and we both felt it under the floor this morning, you with your hand, and me with my chest. So we're going to do the thing I told you about in your first season, the night the RIT engine came. The handing on, while I'm here to hand it, not after when it's a scramble. Now slow on purpose the right way, and we did. It took the rest of that year and most of the next, and it was the best work of my life, and I'll set down the shape of it because it's the part the port never sees and the part that matters most. I did not hand her the range. A range is easy. She'd had the range for years. I handed her the record. I took her slow on the good days down to the cradle master's logging house and stood her in front of the harbor book and made the cradle master enter her, by her name, Slate, as registered under victualler of the third shelf, which he did not want to do because she was vault-born, and there'd never been a vault-born on the victualler's roll of any charter port in the lanes, and I leaned on his counter the way I lean on mine and bored him into it, with the smoke log 14 years deep as my truer number, until her name went into the book in the cradle master's own hand, and the RIT engines of all the salvage in the lanes were from that morning forward logging a gray girl who was not a stray, not wait, not the third country, but a registered fact of a charter port with a standing claim of her own under provision and wayfare. I made her a keeper on the record. The salvage man had said engines go off the record, and there's lanes past the law where a stray's a stray. So I took the stray out of her, on the record for good, in the cradle master's own hand, and made her a thing the record itself would now defend, the way it had defended me. That was the handing on, not the pot, the standing. She fought me on it, which I expected, the way a deep child fights, quiet and stubborn, and to the bone. She didn't want the name in the book. The book was the surface, the third country, the list, and she'd spent 14 years learning to be a fact of one good shelf precisely, so she'd never have to be a name on a list again. And here I was putting her on the worst list of all, the very kind that had priced her in a Hans ledger as gray stray, deep rock stock, revisit. I let her fight me, at the slack of the tides, the two of us at the cold counter, and then I gave her the answer, the only one I had, and it was the answer to everything I'd ever done since the morning of the grain drums. "There's two kinds of lists, child," I said. "There's the kind that prices you, and there's the kind that keeps you, and they look the same from the dark, I know they do. That's the cruelest thing about the surface. The keeping list and the pricing list are written in the same hand on the same kind of paper, and a child who's been priced can't tell them apart and shouldn't have to. But I can tell them apart. That's the one thing 30 years on this rock taught me. And I am telling you that the Cradle Master's book is the keeping kind. I'm not putting you up for sale. I'm putting you in the keeping, the surface kind, the only kind the surface has, the kind that's made of a name and a record and witnesses 3 weeks deep and a clause no Hans man ever read. It's a poor cold version of your deep one's keeping. I won't pretend it isn't, a clause instead of a town. But it's the keeping that works up here, in the third country, against the engines. And I am handing it to you while my hand still works, because the day comes, you felt it come, this morning, under the floor. The day comes when my hand doesn't. And on that day, I need you to already be in the keeping, and not a stray they revisit over a cook's cold range. Do you understand me? I'm not making you wait. I'm making you unstealable. There's a difference, and it's the whole difference, and it's the last thing I've got to teach you. She was quiet a long time, both ears on me. Then she reached out her long gray hand and laid it flat on my breastbone. Reading the slipped and caught and slipping hard under it, the way she'd read it on the floor, and she said stone low, "Then I'll keep the record the way you kept the pot. And when your hand stops, the morning won't." And that, I thought, lying awake that night with my treacherous heart ticking its uneven tick under a gray girl's remembered hand, that is the whole of it said back to me better than I said it, by a child I lied a hand's crew away from with a ladle on a low-tide morning 14. Years gone, and if the tide comes in tonight it can come, the keeping's handed the morning safe, the pot won't go cold. I did not sleep much, but I slept easy, which are two different things, and only the old know it. The tide came in for real 2 seasons after that, and it came in worse than a slipped heart, because the gray-faced man had been right about the precise shape of it. There came a low-tide morning when I was not standing over my pot. I'd had a bad night, the catch coming going in my chest, and Slate had made me lie abed past the dawn bells for the first time in my whole life on that shelf, and she lit the range and started the stew alone. And the smoke went up the flue the way it had gone up every morning for 32 years, and the ship steered in for it. And not one soul on the water could have told from the gray thread of it that the hand at the range that morning was gray too, and the cook was flat on her back behind the dry stores, listening to her own heart miss. That was the thing the salvage man had said could not be covered by the record. The morning the cook isn't standing over the pot, and he was wrong. About it, in the end, and the reason he was wrong was lying banked and quiet against the warm fluestone where I'd once made up a pallet for a stray. The record covered it fine. The record said registered under victualler, third shelf, and the registered under victualler was at her post. But the salvage knew I was down. Ports talk, and a cook who misses her own dawn for the first time in 32 years is news, and the news ran the lanes the way news does, and the gray-faced man, older now, grayer, but a man whose word came true, pushed his writ engine up my shelf one last time on the news that the ladle woman was finally off her feet, and he came to my counter expecting to find a leaderless kitchen and a stray with no cook to lie for her, the exact tide he'd promised 14 years before, and what he found instead was Slate. I was not there for the front of it. I was behind the dry stores with my bad heart, and Slate had told me flat, in the deep low voice, "Lie still, I'll keep it." And for once in my life, I obeyed a child and lay still and kept it back the way she'd once kept back for me. And so I have the front of it only as the port tells it, and the port tells it well, and I believe the port, because I know the gray girl, and I know the shape of what she'd have done. They say she didn't come around the counter. They say she stayed behind it, at her post, the way I taught her without ever saying so, because a keeper keeps from the post. They say the writ engine turned its lens on her and hummed, and the gray-faced man said the old line, "No cook to claim you now, stray." The lean's still open from 14 years back, the engine remembers, and they say Slate let it hum. And then she spoke to the engine and not to the man, the way I'd spoken to the engine and not to the man, because she'd been a child under the counter the morning I did it, and she'd kept it the way she kept everything, exact. She filed her own standing to it. Registered under victualler, third shelf by name, in the harbor book in the cradle master's hand, witnessed and 14, no, by then 32, years deep in the smoke log she now kept herself. She filed the provision and wayfare counterlien in her own name. And then, this is the part the port loves, and the part I love, and the part that tells you she'd understood the whole of it down past the surface words. She filed one thing more, a thing I had not taught her, a thing she'd reasoned out of the deep one's keeping and the surface one's record, and fitted together herself. She filed, to the logging engine, a continuation. She entered into the lane record that the standing of the third shelf victualler was a continuous standing, unbroken, handed keeper to keeper, and that the smoke log proved it, 32 years of unbroken dawn smoke, not one morning cold, 2 hands but 1 fire, and that therefore the open lien the engine remembered from 14 years back, the false lien debt the gray man thought he still held over a stray, had been filed against a person who no longer existed in the record, because the stray had been continued into a keeper, and you cannot press a lien against a continuation. The debt had no body to land on. The stray was gone, not run off, not bought free, continued, kept. They say the engine's hum climbed and climbed trying to price a continuation and could not, because a continuation is not weight and not a stray and not a claim. It is the one thing a pricing engine has no number for, the keeping itself, the pot that outlasts the cook. And they say the hum finally fell to that low grinding settle, the sound of a machine letting a thing go because there was no number it could put on it, and the gray-faced man stood at my counter in front of his own defeated engine, an old man now, and looked at the gray girl who'd been a stray he priced 14 years gone and was now a fact of the record his own law couldn't touch. And the port says he was quiet a long moment, And then he said the second decent thing I ever heard of him saying, said it tired. Said it almost like a man laying down a weight he'd carried too long. She taught you the record. She taught me the record, Slate said. You taught me there'd be a morning she wasn't standing over the pot. You were right. This is it, and the morning's still hot. Sit down, there's stew. It's on the house, the way it was for your crew. The first morning, 14 years back, I was under the counter. I heard her feed them. The pot doesn't price who eats from it. That's the one thing your engine never learned and never will. And the port says she ladled the gray-faced man a bowl of the stew I'd taught her, and he sat at my counter and ate it. An old salvage man fed by the continuation of the stray he'd come twice to steal, and when he'd eaten, he stood and looked at the smoke going up the flue, and he said to nobody, to the smoke. No record covers the morning the cook's not standing over the pot. This one does, Slate said. She built it for 32 years on purpose, so it would. You just didn't believe a cook could build a thing that big out of breakfast. And he had no answer to that, the port says, and he wheeled his law back down my shelf for the last time, and he never came up it again, and within the year the Broken Ring brand had gone off the reach entirely. The salvage moved on to easier coasts, and whether that was the law cutter finally making its run or the Rit engine logging one defeat too many on my shelf or just an old man at the end of his contracts deciding the morning had beaten him, I never knew and never asked. I heard the front of it secondhand, lying behind the dry stores with my hand on my own chest, reading my own slipped heart the way she'd taught me you could, and I'll tell you that I lay there and listened to a gray girl keep my morning against a Rit engine in my own words made better, and the catch in my chest came and went and came and went, and I was not afraid of it, not that morning, for the first time in 2 seasons, because the thing the fear had been about was settled. The keeping was handed, the morning was hers, and she'd kept it. The pot would not go cold. I could go off my feet for good now, and the smoke would still go up the flue, and the ships would still steer in for it, and no salvage on the lanes. Could press a lien against the continuation, and that, lying flat behind the dry stores with my treacherous heart, that was the most peace I have ever been given, and it was given to me by a child I lied away from a hand's crew with a ladle, grown into a keeper who lied no one away from anything because she'd learned to win clean, on the record, with the truer number, the way I'd only ever half managed. I cooked another 3 years after that morning, but I want to be honest about what those 3 years were, because the port has made them into something they weren't. They weren't a triumph. They were a long, slow handing over, and most of it I did sitting on a stool I'd never have allowed myself before on the good days, with my back to the warm flue-stone where Slate had once folded herself in, watching her run my range, calling out the old lore when she wanted it, and keeping my mouth shut when she didn't, which was harder and more important. A keeping handed badly is a keeping clutched, and I'd seen old cooks clutch their kitchens to death, riding the young hand, till it broke or fled, and I'd promised myself on the floor that dawn I'd not be that, so I sat on my stool, and I let her get things wrong her own way and find them right. Her own way, and I bit down on 30 years of how I'd have done it until my jaw ached, and that biting down was the last hard work of my trade and the truest, and no one but me ever saw it. She changed the kitchen, slow, the way a keeper should. She set a second pot. The deep ones, she said, in a colony that grew, would set a second pot off the first, same stock, new fire, so that when a far gallery filled with new weight the keeping reached them too, and there was a far end of hollow port, the low ninth shelf down by the wet cradles where the worst off berthed, the lane strays, and the contract broke, and the ones who'd fallen into the third country and not yet climbed out, and they'd never come up to my shelf because my shelf was where the dock bosses ate, and a fallen man doesn't sit where the bosses sit. So Slate set a second pot down on the ninth shelf off our fire, and she fed it down there at the slack of the tides, the third country end of the port, the unkept end, the end she'd come up out of the ground into 14 years before with a hand's crew pricing her by the drums. She fed the strays, she kept a pot for the unkept, and she did it on the record, registered. A second victualling point under the third shelf's continued standing, so that the strays who ate from her ninth shelf pot were eating from a registered keeping and not a charity, which mattered because a charity can be closed and a registered keeping has a clause behind it that no hands man ever read. I went down to watch her do it once near the end on a good day, carried down the shelves on a sledge the cradle master rigged because my hip wouldn't do the steps anymore. I sat at the edge of the ninth shelf light and I watched the gray girl I'd named for the color of stone ladle stew to a line of the lanes broken and the lanes lost, and I watched a small one come up the line, not vault-born, some other species, some other ruined colony. The lanes are full of ruined colonies. A small one with no tag and no kin, and the third country look I knew too well, and I watched Slate ladle the bowl, and then, before she handed it over, I watched her say something low to the small one that I couldn't hear. and I watched the small one's whole body change the way a body changes when it's just been told, for the first time in its short, hard life, that it is kept. And I knew what she'd said. She'd said some version of "you're on my roll," the lie I told the handsman over the grain drums, except in her mouth it wasn't a lie, because she'd built it into a true thing on the record, the way I'd taught her, the unstealable way. The keeping had reached the far gallery. The pot had outlasted the cook before the cook was even cold. I sat at the edge of the ninth shelf light and watched my whole life turn out to have been about something, and I'd not have believed, the angry young woman who came to this rock running from a thing she won't name, that it would turn out to have been about a gray child feeding strays at the bottom of a port. But it was, and I was glad, and I am not a woman who is glad easily or says so. I had the end one that winter, the slipped heart that doesn't catch, and I had it the way I'd have chosen if anyone had thought to ask me, which is to say I had it at my own range on a cold dawn, with the stew coming to the boil and the first cradle bells ringing and Slate's gray hand flat on my breastbone, reading the beat going wrong and not catching, and she did not lie to me about it the way I'd taught her not to lie at the wrong moments. She said, "Lo, it's the end one. I can feel it. The beat's going, and it's not coming back this time." And I said, or I'm told I said, because the end is hazy to me, "Good. Pull the stock off the boil, don't let it skin, and keep the morning." And she said, "I'll keep the morning." And I went out the way the smoke goes out the flue, gray and steady and up into the open, and the ship steered in for the smoke that dawned the way they'd steered in for it for 35 years. And not one of them knew the cook had died in the night, because the morning was still hot, because the keeping had been handed, because the pot does not go cold when the keeper does, that being the whole and entire point of a keeper, the thing the writ engines never priced and the gray-faced man never believed, and the deep ones knew 1,000 years before any of us came up out of the dark. So that is the account of how I died, which is a strange thing for an account to contain, and you'll have worked out by now that I'm not the one telling it, not really, not the cook. The cook's gone up the flue these many years. It's Slate telling it. It's me. I am the gray girl from under the counter, grown old now myself by the deep one's slow reckoning. Gray going toward dark, and I have kept the third shelf morning at Hollowport for more years now than she kept it before me, and I have set this down in her voice because it was the only honest way to set it down. Because everything I am in her words, the keeping and the record and the lie that's true and the pot that outlasts the cook, and to tell it in my own stone-low voice would have been to pretend I came to any of it alone, and I didn't. I came to it under a counter, in the warm and the dark, watching an old woman lie a hands-crew away from me with a ladle because I was small and unkept and for sale, and she decided for no reason she ever fully gave, that I would not be dragged through a gap in the grain drums while she stood and watched. I am setting this down because one came back grown, and I owed her the account, and a debt on the record gets paid. She came up my shelf on a high-tide morning this spring, off a fast cutter that had no business at a salt shelf port like ours. A tall one in a charter officer's good coat with a lane court seal at the collar, and the cradle master sent a runner up ahead of her white-faced, because a lane court officer coming up your shelf is the kind of news that empties a kitchen. And I stood at my counter, old now, my own hip gone bad the way the cook's went, my own hand reaching for the high shelves slower than it did, and I waited for the law the way the cook taught me to wait for it, from the post, with a ladle in my hand and the boredom of long standing in my face. I had 30-some years of smoke log behind me and a continued standing in the harbor book, and I was ready to bore any engine alive into letting go of any number, and I will tell you my old heart did the thing the cooks used to do, banked low and warm and ready, because a lane court officer means the third country has come for somebody, and I keep a pot for the unkept, and they were not getting one off my roll without the truer number. And then the tall one in the good coat came around the grain drums. They're still there, the same drums, I keep them there. I'll keep them there till the rock wears out. And she stopped, and she looked at the gap between them. The gap a handsman once meant to drag a small gray thing through, and she set her hand flat on the warm flue-stone the way only one kind of person sets a hand on stone, reading it, and her ears turned, both of them, the full attention. And I saw that under the good coat and the court seal she was not human and not vault-born either, but some third thing, some other ruined colony's child, and I knew her. I had ladled her a bowl on the ninth shelf 40 years before, a small one with no tag and no kin and the third country look, and I had said to her the lie that's true, "You're on my roll," and her whole body had changed. And here she was, grown, in a lane court coat, with the seal at her collar that means you write the record now, you are the law the cutters carry. And she had come back up my shelf, the long way, the years and the lanes, and a court appointment between, and she stood at the gap in the grain drums where the keeping first reached her, and she said, in a voice I'd never heard but knew anyway, "You fed me here, bottom of the port. I was for sale and you put me on your roll. Her hand stayed on the warm stone. I've spent 30 years on the cutters running the lanes down, the salvage, the Rit engines, the broken ring brands, and the ones that came after them. I learned the record the way you learned it, the truer number way, except I get to carry it now instead of bore it from behind a counter. I came to tell you the down lane pits are closed. The continuation clause that you filed 40 years back against the defeated engine, it went into the lane code. It's the reason there's no such thing as a registered stray anymore on any charter port from here to the deep dark. Every keeper's continued. Nobody's wait. There's no third country on the lanes I run. Her ears turned. You did that. The cook did that. Through you. Through me. The pot outlasted all of us. And I will tell you that I, who spend words careful to this day, who have never in my long gray life been easy with being thanked, I had to go skim a stock that did not need skimming, the way the cook used to when her throat did something she didn't care for. And the tall one in the good coat let me, because she'd learned somewhere, from me I suppose, the way I learned it from the cook, that you don't reach for a thing you're trying to honor, you let it find its own way out of the dark. When I came back to the counter, she was sitting on the long bench where two handsmen once ate stew off. The house, and she said simpler, the law gone out of her voice, just one kept child to another across 40 years of lanes. I came back grown to tell you it held the whole of it. You can hand it on now and not be afraid of the tide. I've made sure there's no down lane pit for the next one to be dragged to. The morning's safe past your watch and past mine both. So I have set this down in the cook's voice and my own because that is the debt, and a debt on the record gets paid, and the debt was an account. Somebody had to keep the account of how a slow, stubborn woman with a ladle and a bad hip turned a stray off a manifest into a continuation that closed the pits of the lanes, and the somebody is me, the gray girl from under the counter, who promised an old woman dying at her own range that I'd keep the morning, and who has, and who will hand it gray to darker the way she handed it to me, and who has now also got the account written down so that when my own end one comes and doesn't catch, the next keeper will know the shape of the thing she's holding. It is a pot. That's all it ever was. A pot that doesn't go cold, kept in the dark and the warm by whoever's hand is at it, handed down so the keeping reaches the far gallery and the bottom shelf and the small, unkept thing in the gap between the drums. The cook never had a clever word for it. She'd have told you she just didn't want a hands crew dragging a child through a gap while she stood and watched. But I have the deep one's word for it, the hum and pressure one she felt in her breastbone the day I first wouldn't translate it, and I'll give it to you now plain, in the only translation that ever fit, the one I gave her at the last, lying with her gone wrong heart under my hand. The keeper is the thing the dark is not allowed to take. She wasn't the dark's to take, the morning of the grain drums. Neither was I on the 9th shelf. Neither is the next one. Coming up some lane right now towards some port, where the smoke's going up the flue, who'll find when the salvage price is her that the keeping reached the lanes ahead of her, and there's no pit at the end of the manifest, because a cook leaned on a counter once and bored a machine into letting a child go, and the child kept the morning, and the morning is still hot, and it will be hot when I'm gone up the flue too, gray and steady and up into the open, because that is the whole and entire trade, and it was never about anything else. The pot outlasts the cook. Slate keeps the fire. Somebody always keeps the fire. Come up the shelf some dawn and you'll see the smoke, and steer in for it, and there'll be something hot at the end of the night, and a hand at the range and a place on the roll. There's always more here. That's the one thing there's always more of. She told me so, the first morning over an empty cup she didn't think I'd seen her take. There's always more. Sit down. The stew's good.